You know, sometimes all you want is a great shot of espresso. Easy to dial in, fantastic taste, fun to pull. You don't really want to bother with all the stuff that you see people like me talking about in YouTube videos, you know, stuff like swapping burrs, pre-breaker configurations, variable RPM, slow feeding, anything like that. You just want espresso to taste great and you want it to be simple. And that's where the Niche Zero shines. It just kind of works, and that's why I call it the iPhone of coffee grinders. It was the first of its kind, simple, easy to use, incredibly intuitive. But the question that you have to ask is, in 2025, does this grinder still hold its own in the new landscape of coffee grinders? It launched all the way back in 2017, and at that time, there really was nothing else like this. You know, it's single dosing grinder, meaning you weigh out one serving of coffee at a time, very attractive, easy to switch coffees, no hopper on the top, zero retention, meaning in theory, nothing left over in there in between grind doses. And it just made the experience of pulling espresso very fluid and intuitive, and it really took off. And initially, you would see these things like all over social media. Now, Niche did send me a Zero way back in 2021, long before I was making YouTube videos at all. And I have done collaborations here and there with them on Instagram, but as far as it comes to this video, these are my full and honest thoughts about this grinder. You know, Niche doesn't have any input. They haven't seen this video. They're getting their first peek on it at the same time as you. It comes in right now at £449 and ships directly from the UK. So, you know, depending on where you are, there may be import fees that could move the price of this grinder. Materials and sustainability wise, these are manufactured in China. Niche has developed a small factory there, which is audited for workplace and safety standards, which is fantastic. The Niche team is in China at the factory all the time, and in any conversations I've had there, they really stress the personal relationship they have with the people on the ground. Materials wise, it is almost all metal and wood. You know, the body is painted metal, you have the wood accents down here. Not a ton of plastic, excluding the lid, the flow control disc in here. We'll talk about all that, as well as the funnel under here. It's also got this adjustable length power cable that just sort of disappears into the base. Very cool. And one thing I do love about Niche, they have a big emphasis on servicing your products. They provide parts, and they really want to see their grinders maintained rather than thrown if there's ever an issue. Now, just like the iPhone, when the Niche Zero first dropped, you saw this big splash. A lot of buzz, all kinds of people buying them, and you'd see people staying up to kind of wait for that drop to happen, and then people would scramble and try and buy a unit. They were kind of hard to get, but it has also followed the path of the iPhone in some other ways, namely that it hasn't really changed or innovated a whole lot since it was released. It's more or less the same grinder that was designed when it was first released as it is today. Now, there are a couple things that they did update. They added this flow control disc to kind of manage the input flow. That was a very early addition. And then more recently, they updated the catch cup design to have a curved bottom to allow the grounds to slip out of there a little bit more easily. But besides that, the grinder is basically the same as it was when it was designed back in 2017. But the rest of the grinder industry kind of latched on to this form factor and started adding stuff and tweaking things and changing things. You know, you saw flat burrs come into the picture. Grinder manufacturers put in these ionizers in the chute to try and keep static minimized as much as possible. You saw variable RPM. That was another thing that people added. Then you got into burr swaps, different types of burrs to give you subtly different flavor profiles. Pre-breakers designed to kind of stage the breakup of the beans in a certain way. And the Niche Zero never really adopted any of that stuff. It just kind of stayed the way that it is. And that begs the question, you know, is this grinder just kind of outdated? Like, should I just not even consider it anymore because there's newer and there's better options available? And there are those who would say that the answer to that question is absolutely yes. The world has changed. We've moved on. This grinder was great for its day, but you shouldn't consider it. But I would say I don't totally buy that. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Before we get into any of that though, let's have a quick overview of this grinder. It is a single dosing grinder, meaning you weigh and then grind up one serving of coffee at a time. The name Niche Zero was because it was designed as one of the first zero retention grinders, really designed to move every ounce of beans kind of through the system and not leave any hanging out in there to kind of get stale and then mess up your next dose of coffee. And the workflow of using it is wonderful. And that is one of the reasons for the Niche Zero's success. You just lift up the lid, you take your ground coffee. I have 18.1 actually grams of coffee here. I'm gonna just do a little bit of spritz of water, nothing too crazy. Dump it in to here. You set your grind size. I've already done that. Normally you would do that before you put the coffee in. Then you close the lid and flick the switch. And after about 18 to 20, 22 seconds, whatever, it will have all your coffee in this cup. And it spat out 18.0 grams. So within 0.1 of a gram, very typical of this grinder. Usually I would expect to see it between 0.1 and 0.2 grams. And it is very quiet. I did videos way back in the day where Sarah would be wearing our youngest and using this grinder. And, the baby would sleep right through grinding a dose of this right next to it. So it comes in, I think, at about 70 dB or so, very quiet. The dosing cup just kind of slides right into a 58 millimeter portafilter, and then you just do your puck prep and pull a shot. Let's see how we did. All right, let's see how this tastes. This is an El Salvador coffee called El Retiro from Corvus Coffee Roasters, grown by the Pacas family. It's a honey process. Let's give this a taste. And that is just what you want when you want a comfy, cozy shot of espresso. Getting like a very mild acidity, maybe a little bit of apple or maybe plum. Milk chocolate, very thick, very sweet, nice, lots of blend in that flavor, very cohesive, very nice cup of coffee, easy to dial in. And all of that is because of the burrs that is used in here and kind of how they work. The Niche Zero uses a 63 millimeter conical mazer burr. That means like it's a cone shaped burr. And it produces a lot of what are called fines, these tiny little particles in your coffee grounds. If you look at the distribution of particle size, you would see a very wide curve on this thing. So a big kind of range of different particle sizes going into your espresso grounds. Some little tiny bits and then some bigger boulders, they call them. And all that adds up to a very forgiving cup, a very blended cup, and very often a very sweet cup. Now, why did a lot of coffee enthusiasts that you might come across online move on from this grinder when it was incredibly popular with the same audience just a couple years ago? And the reason is that a lot of those people are looking for something a little bit different in the cup. Very often they're looking for a brighter, much more acidity forward cup of coffee, very light body, a lot of kind of pulled apart flavor separation, the ability to kind of pick out those individual notes in a very clear way. Very often that style of cup can be less sweet and not have that same body and presentation. And for anybody who's looking for that type of cup of espresso or coffee, flat burrs, and really even just a subset of flat burrs, tend to produce that a little bit better. And for people who prefer that style of cup, I'm one of them, I enjoy those types of cups too. Very often those people really want to fine tune each and every variable and really fuss over their espresso in kind of this really nerdy way. I have several grinders like this. I'll swap the burrs around to sometimes even find the most favorable burr for a specific coffee. And the truth is that a lot of those grinders and a lot of those setups can be a lot more finicky to dial in than something like this. Until you get really used to them, you're going to have more bad shots. There's a narrower sweet spot on the dial in that you really got to find kind of carefully through trial and error. And for some people, that's fun. For others, that can be really frustrating. And if all you're looking for is a really great cup of espresso, very flattering blended presentation, very sweet, lots of good body in the cup, then this grinder actually does that style still really, really well. It's kind of like the iPhone, does the iPhone have the most tweakability and tunability of all the phones that are out there? No, of course not. Still, millions of people use and enjoy their iPhones. iPhones are great when you don't actually want to think about your phone. You just want to use your phone, let the phone get out of the way, and do what you need it to do, and have an easy, kind of fluid, frictionless experience with your thing. The Niche Zero is like that. Other grinders, they take a little bit more fuss. They will do some specific things, which not everybody is looking for or wants in their coffee grinder. But I have to be honest, I do flip-flop. I really like that style of cup sometimes, and I like the Niche Zero style of cup other times. So for me, this is a grinder that does come out of rotation periodically. I'll throw it on the counter, and I just have to say, when I just want a cozy, familiar, blended, thick cup of espresso, there just is something so satisfying about using this grinder, getting that style of cup, and enjoying it. However, as easy as this grinder is to use, how good the workflow is, however crowd pleasing the cups are, doesn't mean that this grinder is without critique, and I have my critiques as well. Once you set aside that kind of preference of the style of cup that this produces, which I think most people would actually prefer, there are a couple things that I want to point out. First is this lid. This has always been my first and biggest complaint with the Niche Zero, and true to form, it's exactly the same today as it was when the Zero was released. It feels cheap. And it sounds cheap, and you touch it every time you use the grinder, usually 2 times. Nearly everything else about this grinder looks and feels high-end, except the lid. I don't really think that there's a good solution given the way that this grinder is designed, but I wish it wasn't that way. Also, I do find that the grind size drifts as coffee builds up inside the grinder. Now, it is zero retention. It's not a serious buildup. You know, it can vary depending on how often you clean, but you know, even 0.4 grams kind of building up in nooks and crannies over time will cause, in my experience, the grind size to shift a little bit until you clean it out. Now, that's not a huge deal if you're used to cleaning your grinder, but for many people who end up with a Niche Zero, this is the most expensive grinder that they've ever bought. And I'm just going to say that if you are in a position where you've purchased an Niche Zero, you've had it for months, you've never taken those steps to open and clean it, I get it, it's intimidating. This grinder tastes better and it works better when you keep it clean on a regular basis. You know, even once a month, take it out, get over that hump. It's not as complicated as you think. I got a video on this. It's a bit older. I might remake it at some point. Don't use water, only a dry brush, paper towel, that kind of thing. But getting in there and getting all those coffee grounds and coffee oils off of the burrs and all that, it's a really good thing to do. Also, there are a couple springs in here that push that outer burr up. If you ever like lose one while you're cleaning or like vacuum one up by mistake, there are a couple hidden inside this base right here if you ever need a spare. So I do like that they included that. Again, not really a negative, I guess, but really just because very often people aren't used to doing that. And I really feel like this grinder benefits from it. A lot of new grinders these days will have a knocker to kind of knock any last tiny little bit of retention out of this chute. This grinder was designed without one and it still doesn't have one. Even when I ground just there, you know, I sprayed the coffee beans with water, which does help with this a bit. And without doing anything, it was within 0.1 grams. So this is not a huge deal, but if you really want to go to the nth degree to try and make sure that all those grounds work out, you know, you can either just rock it like this and give it a little knock, flip the lid like that, which doesn't sound the nicest. And I have seen paint chip right where this magnet is over time. I would probably recommend doing this. Some people would say, oh, you have to do that to get every last bit of retention out. Totally unacceptable for a grinder at that price. I don't know. I think if you're happy not to fuss over that, that's fine. If you do want this grinder and you want a more elegant solution, there are what's called bellows that you can get. They're like kind of like an accordion that will push air through. A guy operating under the company called Introvert makes them. They fit right in here. They're specifically designed for the niche. Very handy. Again, I think if you don't want to sweat that, it's not going to make or break your shot for sure. And my last dislike, and probably the strongest reason that I would say I may steer you in another direction grinder-wise, is the Niche Zero's performance on filter coffee. You know, they market this grinder as anything between espresso and filter, and it can do that. But just speaking honestly, if you spend like $100 on a hand grinder for filter coffee, you're going to see a lot better performance than you will out of this grinder. And that's because of that particle size distribution. It's got that wide distribution curve with a lot of fines mixed in there, which are most of the time not really ideal for filter coffee. You know, they can cause your brews to stall out on you. They can also make for bitterness and astringency in the cup. And I find that on this grinder, yes, it can do filter, but you are going to get some of that. It really is an espresso first grinder. And if you want to be doing filter coffee regularly and you're thinking, I'm going to get amazing filter and amazing espresso all in one grinder, I'm just going to say you're probably going to be getting subpar cup quality on filter. Also, I'll add that in order to get any kind of reasonable performance on filter coffee, I had to go like way coarser than you would think based on the way that they have their dial marked here. You know, I was up here near the calibrate icon, or even going coarse enough so that I was pointing basically straight up at the 12 o'clock position. Now, as far as comparisons go in grinder world, if you're looking for that standard style of shot, you want a very handsome grinder for your counter. You want workflow that is top marks, you know, like that Apple-esque type experience when you're making your cup of coffee. This is a grinder that a lot of people end up with, and a lot of people end up extremely happy with for a very long time. You know, are there grinders that will produce a shot of espresso and cost less than this? Absolutely there are. You know, the DF64 came out shortly after this. It's at $400 US. The DF54 is an even better deal. Both of those are flat burr grinders. You also have the SD40, which is a conical grinder at like $150. None of those DF grinders are going to give you a comparable user experience to this. They do get the job done. The flat burr versions especially tend to be a little bit more finicky on the dial-in, and overall the experience of using the Niche Zero really comes out ahead of those grinders. Now, if you're looking for that lighter body, more flavor separation, flat burr grinders are better suited than that. So it does come down to a little bit what you're looking for in the cup and how you weigh out all those factors. You also have the option O Casa grinder, very compelling new option. I would say better performance for filter coffee, especially on the Casa. Espresso wise, it's a little bit lighter and more acidity forward of a cup. I would say it doesn't feel as robust, but it does have a nice user experience overall. I would say the Niche Zero does this style of shot a little bit more strongly than the Casa. But if filter is a consideration, and or you're looking for that lighter body style shot, more acidity forward, absolutely you could consider that grinder. Now, for whatever reason, I don't know why this is, I also get a lot of requests about how this grinder compares to the Weber key. And the key, you could buy several Niche Zeros for the same price as a key. So I don't really know where that comparison comes from. I will say the finishes on the Weber key are totally top tier, which yeah, you would expect that at the price. The presentation in the cup, the Weber gives a little bit lighter of a presentation, a little bit more separation while still giving some of that conical blend. It's way more expensive. And even on workflow, you know, the magic tumbler, how that all works, it's really cool. I love all that stuff. The adjusting the grind, loading your beans in, all of that. I think the Niche, it's a little bit less finicky. Both of them use Mazer burrs, similar, but again, a little different places on the spectrum. Overall though, when it comes to the question, is this grinder still relevant? You might not see it as much on social media as it did when it was launched. It is still a fantastic grinder. It does a specific thing really well. You know, if you want thick, syrupy, sweet, forgiving shots, not a huge pain to dial in. You don't want to fuss over your coffee. You want something that looks great on the counter. Maybe blend and body matter a little bit more to you than clarity and flavor separation. It's hard to beat this grinder, honestly. I recommend it all the time in my DMs. People who end up with them love them. Are the super hardcore enthusiasts going with something different? Sure. Very often they have a much higher budget and they're looking for different things in the cup too. Even in comparison to those other grinders though, the Niche Zero is still, its workflow, using it, it's fantastic. The shots are delicious. And even though there's a lot more competition and a lot of people siloing into their preferred segment of features, I think absolutely there still is a nice little home for the niche in today's landscape. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, you love nerding out on this stuff. I love making these videos and just kind of digging in and trying to understand the world of coffee and the equipment that we can use to make it better at home. Hit that subscribe button because it's a pleasure to share my discoveries with you. Again, the best upgrade you can make is actually by just drinking really good coffee. So don't get sucked into this whole world of upgrading stuff. Make sure you're using good coffee first. Everything else comes second. And do let me know your take on the Niche Zero in the comments. I know everybody has a take about this grinder. I'd love to hear yours. If you're an owner, I'd love to hear your experience too. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.